Welcome, everybody, to our webinar today, looking at a live demo on how to seamlessly migrate from VMware to OpenStack. My name is Kevin Ng. I am a Senior Solutions Architect here at Mirantis, and I'll be your host and presenter for today's webinar. For over a decade, I've been kind of delivering DevOps and strategies and testing strategies to Fortune 500 companies across various different sectors, right? Banking, finance, retail, healthcare, logistics, the whole lot. And in my role as a solution architect, I work with customers to really understand and provide solutions for their infrastructure development challenges, such as ones that we're going to talk about today, right, in terms of the migration. Before we actually start getting into the migration process, let's have a quick look at what we're talking about. Now, I think on the VMware side of things, folks are pretty well aware, but our target environment. What is OpenStack, or more precisely, our version, Mirantis OpenStack for Kubernetes? Now, OpenStack is an open source collection of tools that provides your own private cloud, essentially. That it provides things such as compute, networking, storage, load balancing, automation, orchestration, the whole lot, in easy to use composable components. And what we've at Mirantis done is we've taken those components and put them into Kubernetes so that you also get on top of what you have for the private cloud capabilities, the capabilities of Kubernetes, your auto healing, scaling, the robustness, and so on. Those of you that may have dealt with OpenStack before would know of the fun and effort that is needed for any of the maintenance and upgrades of the components. Putting into Kubernetes actually makes it a lot easier. You also have additional components such as Ceph storage and also Stacklight, which is our alerting, monitoring, and logging solution. So this is going to be the target environment that we're looking at for today. And whether you are someone that has used OpenStack in the past or a current OpenStack user, or even a Mirantis OpenStack for Kubernetes customer looking for consolidating their workloads from VMware onto OpenStack, or you may be coming up for your VMware renewal and perhaps are looking for some more cost-effective solutions. Or you may have perhaps heard recently about the news between VMware and AT&T and are concerned about your own VMware environment. Regardless of the reason, looking at migrating from your workloads from VMware onto OpenStack, I think the main thing on most folks' minds is, how do I safely and effectively migrate the many virtualized workloads that I've built up over the years from VMware to OpenStack? And when you think about this, namely, you're looking at a couple of different things, right? One, how do I keep downtime to an absolute minimum to ensure continuous operations? How do I proactively address and reduce potential issues during the migration process? And how do I decrease the manual workload by leveraging automation tools and scripts, right? Because as you know, we all need folks to keep the lights on. We all want to keep our most valuable developer time to actually develop meaningful revenue generating work, which is essentially developing new software. With this in mind, this is what we'll try to cover off in today's talk. All right, how do I make sure these are addressed? So when we're looking at speeding up the migration from VMware to OpenStack, what are some of the things that we're trying to solve, right? Of course, the main thing is we want to migrate workloads and data from VMware to Mirantis OpenStack. The issue is folks are usually strapped in terms of time, resources. This essentially becomes part of a technical debt, right? How do I make sure that this debt is paid really quickly without having to put a lot of manual effort into it? And because a lot of workload is actually unique, you can't really customize your migration process to every single type of workload. You need something that can be generalized, perhaps templatized, and then used with minimal tweaking, perhaps just things like storage and network and so on and so forth, right? So you want to generalize that. And then you want to make sure your deployment is automated. And then, of course, any other third-party services are involved and are automatically taken care of in the dependencies. When we look at our migration strategies, when we talk about cloud migration, maybe I should say, folks typically go into the 6R strategies, all right? And we'll focus on just a few of those. And we'll probably limit it down to three, which is your replatform, rehost, and refactor. But if you think about it, the easiest way, the easiest method of migrating from one environment to another environment is really simply just to restart your workload, right? You're migrating essentially by attrition. So, these are perhaps for workloads that are short-lived. They expire on your source VMware environment. Just port them over to OpenStack, spin it up, restart it. These are for your lower priority workloads, perhaps minimal effort workloads that you could just quickly reinstall. There's of course also options to kind of retain them or just as is, or just retire them completely if they're lower priority, not as important, or once-off type workloads. Now, for those that are higher in business value, and we're talking about the highest ones, right? There's of course the refactor journey that you go through. This requires the longest preparation. That involves reverse engineering perhaps, or taking some of this, looking at the requirements validation, breaking this down. And you then have a couple of different options. Of course, the main thing is to break down a monolithic application into a more modern microservices approach, or even at the minimum to a solo approach. Ideally, you want to containerize them as well for improved performance, scalability, elasticity. In that case, you don't really need a virtualized environment as much. You then go into something like Kubernetes or Swarm instead. Right. So that's kind of what folks usually do in most cases. That, of course, requires investment to remove that technical debt and improve non-functional aspects. And we actually can help with that as well. But these are performed for very highly business critical applications that you really can't. You want to keep running, but you want to make sure they're more effective. But we're going to focus on something slightly different today, which is more of the replatform. Folks usually call it lift and shift, but it's actually more of a lift and reshape, right? Because when you're moving from a VMware environment to an OpenStack environment, there's still going to be minor differences between the two. So we're copying your workload from the source environment, but we're tweaking a little bit with minimal modifications so that things that are VMware specific now can adjust to a more OpenStack specification. So that's going to be our topic for today and our demo. So when we look at the workload migration process then, right, and now we've picked okay, we're going to go in and do our lift and reshape process. What does that actual process look like? Now, we've broken it down into 6 steps. At the start, of course, is the whole migration, your discovery and planning process, which involves making sure that you have an inventory of all the workloads and nodes that are currently on your VMware environment, prioritizing those in terms of business value and also technical difficulty in terms of, well, actually dependency as well, right? How interlaced is it with other components within your environment, so that when you're actually moving things over, you can actually move them over in groups or waves, as we call it. So from there, you then have a migration catalog that you can actually work with. Let me bring up my laser pointer. And then this actual deployment process. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of the migration and validation process, right? You've got all this. Many times in order to export a virtual machine out, you may need to perhaps turn it off, export it into a certain format, and then import it into OpenShift and then have it up and running. Now that, of course, may not be feasible for your production environments, especially for your business critical applications. So we want to make sure that you can actually go through the migration process, at least this part of it, and the validation while your production workload is still online, right? And when you're looking at, of course, the process of migration and operationalize, there's 2 different timelines, right? And there's a delay between your migration, and of course, and when you actually cut over to your new environment, right? So what you want to do, what we're going to be looking at, is how do we make sure we could actually go through this migrate and validate step, go through several iterations of it so that it's safe and robust, and you're pretty confident about it, while maintaining minimal downtime. So if we zoom in a little bit more into this migration and validation step, right, there's 3 different parts to that. One, we have the environment preparation. And this essentially is starting off with establishing the connectivity between your VMware environment and your OpenStack environment to enable the easy transportation of workloads. And I'll show you a little diagram of how it's going to be connected a bit later on as well, right? Of how our tool does that. We then want to make sure that we plan and thoroughly test the migration. Just like any software deployment, even though you're just moving to a different environment, you would still want to be able to thoroughly test that process, right? So we want to make sure we test the migration process. We want to make sure we test the end result of the migration, and if we need to tweak anything, make sure we go through that over and over again until we're quite happy with it. Okay. So we want to make sure that we have an efficient mechanism to quickly create multiple target instances as well for iterative testing. Perhaps some teams will need to test one functionality of it. How do I make sure I could take one of my source target and then push it into multiple target environments? And then during environment cutover, right? So like I mentioned, there's two different phases. There's the environment migration portion of it, which is transferring the workloads from VMware to OpenStack. And then there's the actual cutover, where you're actually redirecting your load balance from your VMware environment to your OpenStack environment, right? And of course, often there's going to be a gap, a delta in the time between your actual data migration and the actual cutover. And we want to address that time gap between the two to prevent any data loss of the current production instance, right? So if you, let's say we migrated on Monday to go through our testing, go through a couple of sprints, we're good to cut over now, let's say on Friday or the week after, 2-week sprint. We now have 2 weeks worth of data that we need to migrate over again, right? So how do I make sure I can actually do that over and over again? So we'll look at how to do that as well in demo. Where we're looking at the actual migration tool, right? So the first step, establishing connectivity between environments. So the Mirantis migration tool essentially sits in the environment. It sits in one of the target environments, right? And most likely it'll be the OpenStack environment, because that's where you're going to be running everything. And then so our migration engine would then go ahead and connect to your VMware environment. There's a replication agent that sits within the SXI server as a virtual machine that would then go ahead and perform a scan of the environment of all the virtual machines in there. And those are the ones that you're going to be migrating over. All right. And there, of course, is going to be access control so that you can't see or migrate virtual machines that don't belong to you, or you don't want it to be visible. And then on the target side, we then have the connection to the OpenStack environment. And what we're going to do then is take the components over there, replicate it over to migration engine storage, and then deploy it onto the OpenStack environment. So we're going to go through a demo of what that looks like. Now, talking about the demo setup, what we're going to be looking at is essentially migrating a database over from a VMware to OpenStack. So the setup is going to be pretty straightforward. We have two environments, one VMware environment and one OpenStack environment. We have a Kubernetes distribution, or K0s distribution on both of these environments, running a very simple to-do app called Tasking. Okay, and all that is going to do is it's just a to-do list, and it's going to be identical on both sides. Now, on the back end of it, though, the Tasky application is going to be connecting to a MongoDB instance, which lives in a virtual machine, currently within VMware only, right? And it doesn't exist in the OpenStack environment. So what we're going to be doing is we'll go ahead and set up the link and actually migrate it over to OpenStack. Okay, so that's a setup of what we're going to be talking about today. Let's go in and have a look at the two environments. First of all, this is my my source environment. This is our vSphere client, and what you'll see is I've got my Kubernetes cluster in here, and I've also got my MongoDB instance. We tagged it as migration, so it's pretty clear. Okay, and this is going to be the virtual machine I'm going to migrate into my OpenStack environment. I have my two to-do list apps that we'll look at in a second. And then when I go over to my OpenStack environment, here is the virtual machines that I currently have within that environment. As you can see over here, I've got my front-end cluster, but I don't have my MongoDB instance. I've also got my migration engine on my OpenStack environment. So this is going to be my source, my target environment here. I've got two to-do list applications, which looks identical, exported just through a port forward to make it pretty easy. So what I'm going to do is really quickly, and this is in my VMware environment, I'm going to just create a new user. All right, I'll just call this Kevin and create a password. As you can see over here, I've already got two different tasks, and I'll go ahead and add a new one as well. Refresh page. Okay, and add. So as you can see over here, I could actually add tasks and view tasks that's currently in my VMware environment. Now, what I'm going to do is really quickly go into my OpenStack environment, and let's try the same thing. Let's try to log in using the exact same user. If I try to log in, it should time out after a little while because remember, we don't have a database backend. It's probably not even going to do anything. Let me refresh it and try this again. Using my password is incorrect because it doesn't exist. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and have a look at the migration process. Remember, what we're going to do is I'm going to take this MongoDB instance and migrate it over to OpenStack, right? And this is going to be my virtual machine here, the MongoDB migration. Okay, so let's go over really quickly to our Mirantis migration tool. So over here, you see I'm already inside my pre-sales area, and we have machine groups, including my MongoDB migration tool over here, right? So what I'm going to do really quickly now is go through a couple different steps, right? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start my replication, and what this will do is take the data on the VMware instance and actually copy it and create an instance of it within the actual workspace. Okay, and then what I could then do is let's give it a few seconds to actually replicate. Thinking today is the 24th. Let me see if I need to refresh this. Nope, we're good. Okay, it's preparing. All right, so this should take a few minutes. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the actual disk of the virtual machine and then replicate it over. The good thing about this is, it's only going to take a long time for the very first time. After that, we're only pulling the deltas, and this would help with the cutover as well, right? So remember when we're talking about the cutover time, there's two, right? There's a migration time and the actual cutover time. So during the initial migration, we're taking the full, let's say, for example, 40 gigs of the machine, and then pulling it over into the workspace and then migrating over into OpenStack. Now, if we make any changes in between after the migration, the initial migration, and before the cutoff, if there's any data addition that is being done because it's in production, if there's any changes that's being done, you could then just sync it. And because we're only pulling a delta, the time to run is really quick, right? Like, as you can see, we're already done over here. Okay. So now that we've got our data synced over, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to start migrating that into my target environment. So to do that, we go through what's called a migration plan. All right. And we've got one set up over here. Inside, it's just a few things that essentially looks at, what subnet is the target going to be on, subnet IDs, CIDR ranges, if there's any additional configuration as needed, right? So in OpenStack, you're able to configure your machine types simply similar to your public cloud providers. So we were saying we're going to deploy this onto an M1 medium instance, right? You could also set this up as a file here, and you could actually open this and put this, incorporate this into your automation as well, right? So it's a straight JSON of the actual migration plan. So it's pretty straightforward. I'll close that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and actually run the migration. Okay, so go through that. And I'm going to call this my webinar. Okay, so here you could actually deploy to several different instances. Now, my migration plan actually uses a static IPU, so that I can only migrate it once. But if you set this up using things like DHCP or so on and so forth, you could actually set up multiple instances of it, multiple cloud sites. You could actually do parallel testing on your target environment before you actually start doing the cutover. Okay, so this is the migration in process. What we'll do is let's go back to the main view, and then now you can see I have an active migration and it's actually creating the machine in my target OpenStack environment. Okay, so if I go over your OpenStack really quickly, refresh this a little bit, right? We don't see anything yet, so we'll just come back to here and have a look at status. So this typically takes a few minutes of time, just about 4 minutes or so, there and thereabouts. So a few things to kind of look at as well, right? What we're showing over here is really just a small part to the equation, workload migration. So at Mirantis, our workload migration process is kind of split into two different parts, right? There's a tooling that you're actually seeing over here. And then there's the services on top of that that actually does the portions beforehand. So this is talking about these steps over here, the discovery and planning process. Now, when we're going through this, most folks that I've talked to, the discovery and planning is, well, actually, I think there's bottlenecks in various different areas. And just responding to one of the questions over here on, which areas do folks kind of reach out to most for, right? So it's varied, right? So I've got customers that are saying, you know what, we want to start the process, but our inventorying the different workloads have been problematic, right? And this is perhaps not so much for the migration, but more so for things like when I'm kind of refactoring virtualized workloads for containerization, right? So that's kind of in the discovery and planning process. And it's really not the inventory of the workloads, but it's the classification of workloads that actually is the time-consuming portion of it. So we've actually we're able to help through tooling and services as well to automate some of that. Scan through the actual workloads on the virtual machines, and depending on the interconnectivity of the applications or even the technology, right? So, like, for example, is it a JBoss? Is this a Node.js, or if it's just straight Python? Depending on that, what is the technical difficulty of containerizing it and migrating over, assisting with that, and then through services, help with the planning of that as well, right? So that's one side of it. And then the other part of it, of course, is the actual migration, right? So, taking a VMware instance and then moving it into something that is OpenStack equivalent, of course, involves the exporting and importing. And that's what we're actually looking at helping out with over here in the tooling that we're showing. Okay, so that's the two sides that folks usually, we talk to folks about. Right, so now my status is running, which tells me then my new virtual machine is now up and running. Right, so let's go back to our instance over here. See, previously I have 2, 4, 5 machines over here. Let's refresh this really quickly. Yes, there we go. And you can now see my new MongoDB migration virtual machine has been set up in OpenStack, right? So it's actually converted my virtual machine from a vSphere ESXi version into an OpenStack instance with the IP address that I've actually specified within the migration plan, using the flavor of virtual machine that I've specified in the migration plan as well, right? So it's currently up and running. So now if I go back to my OpenStack instance, then I could then try to log in using my, let me refresh this just to be on the safe side. All right, okay, there we go. Let's try to log in and go test, then my password. And fingers crossed, I should be able to log in and see my tasks. There we go. Hold up. Took a bit of time to spin up the instance, but as you see, it's fully replicated over into my OpenStack environment. Within this really short demo, we've looked at the various steps of migrating over from VMware into OpenStack environment. Looked at the actual process of migrating an instance over. What we haven't actually showed you, which is going to take a little bit more time, what I'll do is I will quickly go over to here as well, is the setting up the agents, right? So you see over here, it's got the migration agent. It's really straightforward. It's within the tool, we just install the migration agent, so it'll actually spin up a virtual machine in the vSphere environment. And that'll be performing all the syncing over to OpenStack. I also encourage you to visit our website at mirantis.com/VMware alternatives to look at more details about the migration process and the migration tool, and also some of the offers that perhaps would be able to help you in consolidating your virtualized workloads and looking for more cost-effective measures. Right, like I mentioned, if there's any questions as well, feel free to reach out to me within email or via LinkedIn. We do have two webinars coming up, one geared more towards the virtualization side of things on looking at running OpenStack on Kubernetes at scale. This will be on October 29th at 12 Eastern, 9 Pacific. And this will be presented by our product manager, Artem. And then we also have a tech talk coming up on November 12th, which personally, I'm really interested. I'm certainly going to be joining as well. Looking at service availability with Kubernetes in a power interrupted environment. This is really interesting, I think, for those of you that are in more challenging environments or even at the edge locations. Right, so this will be on November 12th at 9 Eastern, 3 Central, and Central? Oh, ECT. And this will be presented by Justine, CTO of Demographo Analytics. Again, highly encourage you to both visit our website and also join the upcoming webinars for some really good information. I'm very happy to be able to present this information to you, and I'm, again, excited for you to join me in this one, and look forward to seeing you in upcoming webinars. So thank you very much and have a good day.